Her hands were shaking when she carried the case out of the attorney's office, and her uncle's laughter followed her all the way into the January cold. The case was hideous. That was the only honest word for it. Paint-splattered wood, hinges rusted to a deep orange-brown, the leather handle cracked along the seam and wrapped in a strip of duct tape someone had applied decades ago and never replaced. It was roughly the size of a briefcase, but heavier than it had any right to be. And something inside shifted when she walked, a muted rolling sound, like a secret it wasn't quite keeping. Maren Hollis, 31, had given 3 years of her life to the man who had owned it. 3 years of cancelled plans and borrowed money and nights sleeping in a recliner next to a hospital bed, set up in a living room in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And this filthy, ridiculous, ugly thing was what she had to show for it. 4 days later, in a locked examination room on the 3rd floor of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Dr. Corbin Ashby, 58, senior curator of American art, would unroll what was inside that case and press both palms flat against the examination table. He would stand that way for almost 2 full minutes, not speaking, while Maren watched his face go the color of old paper. Then he would turn around and tell her in a voice stripped of every professional affectation he possessed that she needed to sit down, even though she was already sitting. And then this man, who had appraised Winslow Homer originals and Edward Hopper studies for 3 decades without adjusting his expression, would press the back of his wrist against his mouth and cry. He didn't give her a number that day. He called security to lock the building. Walter Hollis had been, by most accounts, an ordinary man. He'd driven freight trucks for 32 years on the I-78 corridor between Allentown and Newark before his knees gave out, and he retired to a 2-bedroom house on the east side of town, with a basement workshop he loved more than most things, and a backyard garden he'd been meaning to plant for 15 years. He was 76 when the Parkinson's diagnosis came. He took the news the way he took most things. Quietly, with a cup of coffee held in both hands and a long look out the kitchen window at the yard he'd never planted. He didn't call anyone for 2 days. When he finally called Maren, he spent the first 10 minutes asking about her job before he got to it. She had been working as a physical therapist at Penn Medicine in Philadelphia. 18 months into what she'd understood to be the beginning of her career, she remembered exactly where she was when he called, on her lunch break, sitting in her Civic in the parking structure on Spruce Street, eating a sandwich with the radio on low. She drove to Allentown that same evening and sat with him at his kitchen table while he showed her the discharge paperwork and explained, in the careful way he had of explaining things, what the next few years were likely to look like. She arranged a leave of absence the following week. By the end of the month after that, when it became clear that a leave of absence was not the right shape for what was needed, she called her supervisor and resigned. She moved her boxes into Walter's spare room. She converted the dining room into a proper care space, learned his medication schedule by heart, and taught herself the physical therapy protocols specific to Parkinson's management so she could continue what she would have been doing, professionally, for him for free, every single day. 3 years, that was how long it took. She sat with him through the nights when the tremors were bad enough to keep him awake, and the only thing that helped was someone else in the room. She drove him to his neurologist appointments in Philadelphia and held his arm in parking lots when the pavement was uneven. She read to him history books, mostly American history, which he preferred to everything else because he said fiction required you to trust the author, and had never been good at that. She watched him get smaller and kept reading. His son, Phillip Hollis, 54, called on holidays and sometimes on birthdays. He ran a commercial real estate development firm out of Atlanta and spoke about his schedule the way people speak about weather. Something that simply existed and imposed its own conditions on everything around it. He sent a fruit basket at Christmas and an email at Easter. He flew to Pennsylvania twice during the 3 years. Once for a weekend when Walter had a particularly bad episode that the doctors had flagged as a turning point. and once about 4 months before Walter died, unannounced, for a visit that lasted 2 days, and which Phillip explained as a chance to check in. During that second visit, Maren had noticed him spending time alone in the basement workshop. She hadn't asked why. She was too tired to ask about most things by then. Walter died on a Tuesday morning in October, at home with no noise and no drama, the way he had always seemed to want to go. Maren was sitting in the chair beside him. The reading of the will happened 6 weeks later in the office of Franklin Beckett, Walter's estate attorney, a careful man in his late 60s, who placed a glass of water in front of each chair before he spoke. Phillip arrived 12 minutes late with his wife Lena, 51, who wore a dove-grey cashmere coat that probably cost more than Maren's monthly rent, and kept her sunglasses on until Beckett asked everyone to settle. Maren sat across the table in the black blazer she'd owned for 3 years, with a pair of slacks that were slightly too short because she'd ordered them online during a rare free hour and never returned them. The reading was thorough and not gentle. Phillip received the house on Maple Street and the full contents of the basement workshop, which had been appraised at $34,000 in tools and equipment. He received Walter's 2019 pickup truck. He received the savings account $181,000, built over 4 decades of long-haul driving, and a man who packed his own lunch. He received the investment portfolio, the life insurance payout, the personal property of the house, including the furniture and the 40-year collection of first-edition American history books that Walter had ordered, one at a time, from a used book dealer in Vermont, whose catalogue he received by mail. Maren sat with her hands in her lap and did not move. Then Beckett cleared his throat and read the final clause. To my granddaughter Maren, for her presence and her steadiness through the years when I needed it most, I leave the contents of the locked storage closet in the northeast corner of the basement workshop, specifically the old traveling case and whatever it holds. Phillip turned to look at her across the table, and then she would think about this moment many times afterward. He smiled, not a sorry smile. Not the smile of a man who felt even slightly bad about any of this. It was the quiet, satisfied smile of a man who has arranged something to his liking and is watching it unfold exactly as planned. God, the old paint case. He shook his head. I completely forgot he still had that. Lena reached across and touched his forearm. Maren, I'm so sorry, Lena said. The texture of her voice was an almost perfect imitation of sympathy. You gave so much of yourself these past few years. I know this must be difficult. He always held on to the most sentimental junk, Phillip said, already turning back to Beckett. Probably thought it had some kind of value. You know how he was. He stood and buttoned his jacket. Beckett, can we start on the paperwork? I have a 6 o'clock flight. One of Beckett's assistants retrieved the case from the basement. She carried it upstairs and set it on the conference table, and Maren looked at it for the first time. It was worse than she'd imagined. The wood was dark with decades of accumulated grime, the surface stippled with old paint in a dozen colors, white and cobalt and a deep ochre and a rust red that might have been paint or might have been something older. The brass latch on the front was buckled and corroded. The whole thing smelled of turpentine and time. I'd check for rodents before you open it, Phillip said from the doorway. He laughed as he walked out. Lena laughed too, softly, already reaching for her sunglasses. Maren drove back to Philadelphia with the case in the back seat, secured with the seatbelt across it. She understood, distantly, that this was not a rational thing to do. She did it anyway. Her apartment was a 1-bedroom in West Philadelphia that she'd been subletting to a graduate student during the years in Allentown and moved back into after the funeral. The radiator knocked all night and the windows leaked cold air at the frames, even when they were latched shut. There were boxes she still hadn't unpacked. She set the case on her kitchen table and sat across from it with a cup of tea that went cold while she just looked at it. Her bank balance was $847. She was behind on car insurance. She had accumulated $34,000 in credit card debt over 3 years of covering her own living expenses, because the caregiver stipend Walter's estate had set aside for her had run out partway through the second year, and she'd kept going anyway. She needed a job. She needed several things before she needed a job. She was 25 pounds lighter than she'd been 3 years ago, and she still woke up at 3 in the morning to check on someone who wasn't there anymore. She found a flathead screwdriver and worked at the hinges for 20 minutes until they gave. Inside, packed tight and wrapped in layers of old newspaper, the yellowed, brittle kind, dates from 1984 on one page and 1991 on another, was a single rolled canvas. It had been wrapped in additional paper, tied with kitchen twine, and beneath the outer layer was something different, heavier, smoother, folded with the kind of deliberate care that suggested the person doing it was thinking about the future. It had been sealed at the edges with wax. Maren didn't unwrap it further. What stopped her was the inscription on the outside of the inner paper, written in faded pencil in a hand she didn't recognize, WM. Keep this safe. HTL, Nov 1931. She sat with those initials for a long time. Then she photographed them and went looking. 2 hours of searching produced nothing concrete about HTL that felt connected to anything Walter had ever mentioned. But the combination of the initials, the date, and the obvious care with which the object had been stored made her certain of one thing. She should not open it at her kitchen table in West Philadelphia. Whatever this was, it had been kept intact for almost a century. It deserved better than her screwdriver and a cup of cold tea. She called the Philadelphia Museum of Art the following morning and asked for the curatorial department. Dr. Corbin Ashby received her in a small conference room off the main American Art Gallery and made clear, with a practiced politeness that contained very little actual warmth, that his department had a formal process for unsolicited submissions, and that this meeting had been arranged as a courtesy exception because her inquiry had referenced the initials HTL, alongside a date in November 1931, and that particular combination had been flagged in the department's long-running research files for reasons he wasn't prepared to explain until he'd seen what she had. He was tall and thin, with reading glasses he removed and replaced as punctuation, and a jacket the color of wet slate. His manner was the manner of a man who had spent a career looking at things people believed to be treasures, and finding them to be, in most cases, something much more ordinary. Maren put the wrapped canvas on the conference table. "I haven't unwrapped it past the outer newspaper," she said. "Something about it made me feel like I shouldn't do it myself." Corbin considered this. Then he put on cotton gloves and began removing the outer layers with careful, practiced movements. When he reached the inner paper, the heavier, sealed sheet, he stopped. He leaned in close and read the penciled inscription without touching it. Where did this come from? "My grandfather's basement in Allentown. He left it to me when he died in October. His grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, was named William Morrow. He went by W.M. Corbin straightened slightly. He picked up his phone and sent a text. A minute later, a younger colleague appeared in the doorway, looked at the inscription, and left again without speaking. Corbin retrieved a small kit from a cabinet and began to break the wax seal with careful precision, working the edges loose in a way that preserved the paper. He took a long time. Maren watched his hands and did not say anything because something in the quality of his stillness told her not to. When the inner paper came away, there was one more layer, thin conservation paper, the kind used in archival storage. Corbin cut along one edge with a scalpel. He rolled the canvas out on the examination table, positioned a handheld UV lamp above it, switched it on, and went completely still. Maren watched his face. She saw something pass across it that she would describe later, to the only friend she told the story to that week, as what a person looks like when they encounter something they had stopped believing existed. His right hand came up very slowly, and he placed it flat on the edge of the table, fingers spread. He stood that way for a long time, long enough that she started to worry. Dr. Ashby. He didn't answer immediately. He moved the lamp across a section of the canvas near the lower left corner and then very carefully set it down. He took his glasses off, pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose, replaced them. "I need to ask you not to move," he said, "and I need to make a call." He stepped to the far corner, turned his back to her, and spoke into his phone in a voice too low for her to hear. The call lasted about 2 minutes. Then he came back to the table and looked at the painting again, and then he looked at her, and she saw that his eyes were wet. "Are you familiar?" he said, his voice entirely different now, the professional surface of it gone, something much more unguarded underneath, "with a painter named Horace Talmadge Lanning?" She was not. He told her. Horace Talmadge Lanning had been among the most technically accomplished American regionalist painters of the late 1920s and 1930s. Not the most famous, he said. Not Grant Wood, not Benton, but regarded by the serious curatorial world as someone who had done something the others hadn't quite managed. Painted the Lehigh Valley's industrial edges and rural margins with a precision so exact and so emotionally weighted that looking at his work felt less like looking at a painting and more like being handed someone's private grief. He had stopped exhibiting in 1938 with no explanation. He had died in 1944. 17 of his paintings were confirmed to exist. In the last 20 years, each had sold for between $3 and $8 million. 17, Maren said. 17 confirmed. She looked at the canvas on the table. It was a landscape, a pale winter morning over a wide valley, a ridgeline above, a scattering of industrial shapes in the far distance, half dissolved in early haze. In the foreground, a dirt road and 2 bare trees, their branches rendered with a precision so fine they looked like cracks in cold glass. It was a quiet painting, not dramatic, not immediately striking, but there was something in it that made her want to keep looking. "There is an entry in Lanning's personal journal," Corbin said, steadying himself, dated December of 1931. He describes a painting he had recently completed and given away, a winter landscape of the Lehigh Valley, which he'd titled Winter Morning, Lehigh Valley. He writes that it was the only work he had ever made purely for himself, that he had no intention of ever selling it, and that he had given it to the man who worked for him, because he could no longer afford to pay him and felt this was the most honest thing he owned. He paused. "We have known about that journal entry for 45 years. Art historians have been looking for this painting since 1979. The room was quiet. "He gave it to William Morrow," Maren said. "Yes." "My great-great-grandfather." "Yes, and William Morrow kept it and passed it down, and eventually it ended up locked in your grandfather's basement." She looked at the painting for a long moment. "What is it worth?" Corbin looked at it too, and then back at her. "Christie's will tell you better than I can." His voice was careful. "But the highest Lanning ever sold at auction went for $7.4 million in 2022. This one." He shook his head, and something in his face made her understand that the number he was imagining was not smaller than that. "This is the one everyone has been looking for. That changes things considerably." He picked up his phone and called security. He asked them to lock the building. The world moved faster than Maren had expected it to. She had imagined months of waiting, authentication committees, slow correspondence, the careful bureaucracy of institutions. What she had not understood was that the Philadelphia Museum of Art already had a research file on the missing Lanning, that Christie's New York maintained a standing alert, and that the closed world of American regionalism scholarship was roughly the size of a small town, and news in a small town does not wait. She was in a hotel room, a real one, paid for by a retainer advance from Christie's, on Thursday evening when Phillip called. She let it ring twice, then she picked up. Someone from a museum called the house. His voice had lost its ease. Something underneath was exposed now, working hard. "What is in that case?" A painting. Silence. A painting Grandpa kept locked in his basement for 30-something years, which he left to me in writing, with an attorney as witness. She kept her voice level. I've retained Judith Hargrove. She was an assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District for 11 years. She's been in private practice for 8. I'd suggest your attorney look her up before filing anything. He hung up. Judith Hargrove, 52, arrived the following morning in a charcoal suit with a leather portfolio and the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had cross-examined people for a living and did not find conflict stressful. She liked the case, she said, and she had 2 things to tell Maren. The first, the will was airtight, and the painting was legally Maren's without question. The second, she had run a routine financial review of the assets Phillip had inherited, and they needed to discuss what she'd found. The house on Maple Street carried $287,000 in deferred property tax liens that the county had held in abeyance during Walter's lifetime, and which had now transferred, in full, to the new owner. Walter's savings account had been partially encumbered by a legal agreement, a care cost assumption document, that Phillip had co-signed during his second, unannounced visit to Allentown, in exchange for being named primary financial beneficiary of the estate. He had signed it. He had paid nothing toward it in 2 years. The outstanding balance was $163,000. He came back that second time to sign a document that would help him inherit more money, Maren said. Yes. And then he didn't pay what he agreed to pay. Correct. The document is enforceable. The estate attorney missed it because Phillip didn't disclose it. But it's real, and the liability transferred with the assets. Maren was quiet for a moment. He spent 3 years maneuvering himself into the right position, she said, and never once looked in the case. The one thing he didn't look at, Judith said, was the only thing worth having. Phillip came to the hotel that afternoon with his attorney, a real estate litigator from Center City, who had, within the first 12 minutes of Judith speaking, developed the expression of someone who had just realized he'd been given the wrong map. Lena was not with him. She had apparently left for Atlanta that morning, and Phillip had not mentioned this, and his attorney had not asked. Phillip himself looked like a man who had been standing in cold water for 24 hours. The ease was gone, the Rolex confidence, the smile, all of it. What was left was a man trying to hold his face in a neutral position and not quite managing it. His attorney made one attempt. Something about the painting being workshop property under the language of the inheritance clause. Judith answered it in 4 sentences and did not raise her voice. Then Phillip looked at Maren for the first time in the conversation, really looked at her, not past her, and she could see that he was trying to find something to say that would change the shape of what was happening, and not finding it. You came to his house twice in 3 years, she said, not accusatory, just the fact of it. I was there every day for 3 years. I was there the day he died. I was the one he called when he got the diagnosis. She stopped. He knew what he was doing when he wrote that will. He knew what he was doing when he let you laugh at that case. He was protecting it the only way he knew how, by making it look like a joke. Phillip said nothing. His attorney gathered his papers. They left. The painting sold at Christie's, New York, 11 weeks later for $9.2 million. 7 bidders. A private collector in Connecticut won. The Smithsonian lost by a significant margin and reportedly took it badly. The sale set a new record for Lanning at auction and ranked among the highest prices ever paid for an American regionalist work. Maren paid off every debt she had on a Tuesday morning, sitting at her kitchen table, with the radiator making its noise. It took 40 minutes. There was no particular feeling to it, just numbers going to 0. One after another, like turning off lights in a house you're leaving. When the museum had returned the traveling case to her after authentication, cleaned and with the hinges repaired, she had found something tucked into the lining that she hadn't seen before. A folded piece of Walter's personal stationery the kind he used only for things that mattered. The handwriting was unsteady, the letters shaped with effort. Maren, by the time you find this, you'll have figured out what's in here. That means you stayed. I always knew you would. Your great-great-grandfather, William, kept it safe for 60 years, and I kept it safe for 40 more. It's your turn. Do something good with it. All my love, Grandpa. She read it twice. She folded it carefully and put it back. The case sat on her bookshelf now, cleaned and quiet, the rust gone from its hinges, ugly, still, not something most people would look at twice. But that was the point, wasn't it? If you've ever been the person handed the heaviest thing in the room while everyone else walked off with the easy prizes, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about what people leave behind, what gets hidden, and who finally finds it, subscribe to Own the Drama. We're here every week, and we don't rush the ending.